I don't want to bring this back down to a worldly level, but there was one report that crossed my desk, and it was the statement that perhaps even a few days before the planned mass invasion, that there were multiple groups of strangely odd and strangely coordinated people running around murdering people with impunity. And that they were running around for quite a few days, even though they only planned a 3-day type of thing, because they considered themselves to be in such an overwhelmingly superior position to do what they planned on doing. So that should just give you a little indication of what's out there or what's ahead, or what some of these counterintuitive social policies are meant to make happen and sustain. So, if you're a naive person like all the people in Sweden apparently are, then it's nice to know little things like that, because then you probably could put two and two together if you have someone that does that. But there seems to be a disconnect between policymakers and the executive bodies, or perhaps both. But here's the thing about systems that don't work. There's a lot of things not working because of that, and that's visible to independent contractors. Real experts, like a world-renowned heart physician versus a butcher. There might be some people that don't see the difference, but certain people certainly do know the business. They're not going to go to the butcher for open heart surgery. So here's the good news. The patient can be cured, but it does require a couple of incisions and perhaps a recovery period and a monitoring period, and but perhaps different types of medicinal approaches that might also be of a psychological nature. And how about an educatory or public awareness type of nature, like this is dangerous, or if you've seen this, report back. If you see things like this, let us know. Call 1-800-Ghostbusters. Something like that. And then just have the people that know how to deal with things like that, which shouldn't be a few of them, I would say. Perhaps quite a few more of them that you think you need. Maybe 3 times more. 5 times more. I would go with 5 to 10 times more if you can afford it at this time, because what will you be affording in the years to come if you don't get basic things like people throwing grenades in houses and having them explode on a regular basis? Will lead to, with all of your utopianist, ideologically driven misperceptions and hateful, poisoned frames that are being applied in an organized way by really hipster-like, inside, trendy, fashionable people. So where do all these bad ideas get splattered out? Like a bacterial orifice. That's what needs a scrubbing. The originality of the thing, you can do that with culture too. You can restore it if it's been vandalized. And there's not just nothing wrong with doing that, there's everything right with doing that. Restoring the right culture. An appropriate one that is, because it's been chosen, because it is spectacular, it is worth restoring. Hej då, Ferengians. Realize these aren't just armed groups. You'd also have to imagine they're probably not that skilled. Like they thought they could be, super duper operators, but they were probably pretty damn shabby. Probably didn't put up a whole lot of a fight and probably did a lot of stupid things. Probably ended up getting themselves blasted, which is why it's not a recommended thing to do. But useful idiots might be cajoled into doing it and getting way over their heads real quick. But realize they also had social games, so they played different parties off of each other, different ethnic groups. That's one of their uh, games. And they were playing it since the 60s. And by the time the internet came around, that just accelerated. But of course, you had a bunch of issues at the time. You had a democracy, you were able to talk about things, people were looking for answers, and they misdirected the people looking for answers. Just like people looking for environmentalism, they got this political climate change agenda instead. And not just that, they got probably pitched every different type of cultural pathogen they possibly could. Some of them are probably just like spinning, like again, chrome torpedoes, that's not an exaggeration. These people are completely impenetrable, completely dedicated to toxic and destructive socio-economic and political causes. They're committed zealots. They're the equivalent of a person that puts on a vest of TNT and drives into a building and hits the button. But even worse than that, because that's like a dramatic ending to their misdirection, whereas human torpedoes, they float as long as they got 2 feet and enough to eat. So don't underestimate it. This is not just young people, although there's a whole lot of those, but there's ones, the old ones, that are still in the game. So you got to imagine what type of polishing they got to see things their way, the wrong way, and to convince others and to cover for that. I said in a previous episode, some of them have been hunted down by just curious people. And when they knock on the door and they open up, they ask a few questions, they have zero regrets. They're still very convinced to the point of being obnoxious, such as to infer that you don't understand why what they did was the right thing to do, because they thought it was when they did it, and they haven't changed their minds. And they won't be changing it for you, at least not in front of a camera, because they want to signal to the other people in on it, just like them, that they don't have any qualms with how they live or what they did. They don't. You meet that con man that conned his way to where he got. He's not going to be asking for your permission to forgive himself. He just doesn't have anything there. It's like a refrigerator with nothing inside but maybe some green mold. Like it smells like that acidic smell. If you ever open a refrigerator that's been closed for a while, and the ring, the elastic ring, it congeals into almost like a strip of glue, and it rips when you open it. And you stick your nose in there and you sniff real deep. That's what it smells like inside a polished chrome torpedo. Returning to the abstraction of people that have made unfortunate decisions for themselves or adopted an unfortunate Weltanschauung point of view, a poisoned, misdirected, toxic point of view. They're the ones that suffer by that. So although it's a tragedy, it is what it is. It's what happened. Terrorists have victims, and victims come in different shapes and sizes, and the psychosociological victims, yeah, they have certain characteristics. Sort of like you'd have to dig into the 800,000 fentanyl deaths this year to sort of correlate how they were put on the wrong path that they were, maybe by their trusted doctor that prescribed them the junk the first time, that might have been trained in one of their special facilities. Or let's just give him the benefit of the doubt. He was taught that in school maybe by the pharmacy lobby, like, oh, you know what, this is a miracle. You should be prescribing this more. It's like a traveling salesman type. You don't think they existed? Is that how an epidemic gets started? What is the reverse engineering of those processes, and how to shut them down now, yesterday, tomorrow, next week, next year? The longer you wait, the worse the results. That's sort of what scientists of social pathogens can tell you. 5 days without acting, that's 5 lost days where the effects of these groups is multiplied. Also, like a certain math function that is exponential. That's something bacteria can really teach us, is that bad things can grow exponentially. That means, 3 times 3 is 9, 9 times, right? 3 is 27, like you see how that shoots up? I mean, you just had 3 and now you have 27, whoa. It's a lot harder to get rid of 23 of something than it was of 3. So that's why, again, the criminal negligence charge, when did they start this? We could say 2014. Anybody from 2014 to today in positions of security are criminally negligent, period. Now, maybe some of them will change their ways now that they know. They're no longer hindered by ignorance. But if they don't react appropriately, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a lot of people, by the way. That's a big budget. That can also be attributed. Misdirection of funds, that's a good one. The fire department that gets $1 million, but all the houses in the neighborhood burn down, that can be attributed to their negligence. And that is you can attribute a monetary number to that. The financial, the cultural damage that they committed on their watch. That absolutely could be a significant indicator in enlightened worlds of the future. The people who grasp how essential it is to have healthy, flourishing, and secure societies. That, yes, also have an economic component, but not necessarily the determinant component, but certainly a part of it, but perhaps also a part that is somewhat self-sufficient, so that you have a self-sufficient midline, and then you have the potential to scale up if you want to, or if it's worth it, or if you want to hand it off to someone else that can do it instead. because there's not really any barriers in a harmonious social setting where all of the people, players, factors, thinkers, philosophers, poets, astronomers, mathematicians, musicians, athletes, alpinists, permaculturalists, so many other marvelous subcultures that could so much more benefit by greater association and less sabotage than we experience at this time. So why can we not change and get there? And as far as all of the denizens of the arts, I'm terribly, terribly bored by my political treatises. Remember that all of you do a lot better when all of the parts of society are working well. Especially those that might be a little bit less fortunate. That they are parts of families, and if they're cared for and attended to in a respectable way, then the parts of the family that they're connected to will not look like all the life has been sucked out of them, as if like a vampire has just squeezed every drop of vitality out of their lives thanks to these misdirected social policies and their purveyors and astroturfers. So don't let yourself get misdirected, and if you've been misdirected, direct yourself back to greener pastures. Get off the hate train and walk back, even if it's in your bare feet. As for the Swedish intellectual class, which has been so terribly atrophied and substituted with airheads and repeaters and explainers, there's no reason in the world of Russia or Sweden, for especially not Sweden, should be drab or boring or retrograde or anything else. There is so much you can do with Sweden, and complaining about it isn't a good option. It's reinventing what Sweden is in a better way, not in a fake way. What is it that you loved about London during a certain time period when things weren't going so disastrously wrong as now? How can that be recreated in Sweden, at least the aspects of it? How? Can it not be done? Can it not be done better? I would love to see a renewed Swedish culture. One that is even more excellent than Sweden's of the past, and yet we have this doomerism combined with escapism, combined with defeatism, combined with boredom. Like, why in the hell is it so boring? How can that be changed? It's a cultural question, and yet boredom, how do you deal with boredom? What about meditative prayer? What about that? What about mental hygiene? What about physical and mental excellence? What about a more convincing qualitative form of life? Why not? What's holding you back? There's got to be a couple of people with a couple of ideas that have been around the block a couple of times that could contribute to a marvelous project like that would have so much benefit to so many other people, even outside Sweden. Swedish design. Now, I'm not going to overdo it because it is tedious to keep harping on it, but Swedish design has definitely contributed to the quality of people's lives. And yet, why just in a materialist sense? Why not in a spiritual sense? And yet, you cannot cease being Sweden and reinvent Swedish to be something that it's not. Although you can do that, but that's cultural vandalism, isn't it? It's replacement. It's counterfeit. It's astroturf. Yes, it is. Yes, indeed. You could find that anywhere. It's cheap. It's ugly. It doesn't work. It's malicious. That's what it is. Now, at this point, there might be naive, misinformed people that are still on board with it, but anyone paying attention is completely against it for understandable reasons that really need not be explained. But you can't have two things at once. This is not doublethink. You cannot have something completely opposed to the thing you are stating to want to preserve or to develop. You can't have it. But if you have these people who insist that both have to exist at the same time, well, guess who's the problem? It's them. They're wrong. In the free air of free exchange of ideas, they lose. Now, what did you would think if they were a good people that they would take that knowledge to heart and change their ways, but they don't see it that way because they're motivated in a different way. And that's not so that there are good or better things for most people, but good things for themselves alone, whether that's bad for other people or not. They sort of overlook that part. They're conflicted on the issue, understandably, because they benefit from negative policies. They're free riding on negative policies. What an understandable human condition. But why should you be mesmerized into seeing it their way? It is a shame. It's not 100% of people that are bad, but even if 20% are, you don't need 20% more problems. What? When was that a good idea? And if you want to say, well, the Swedes, there's something wrong with them, that this experiment keeps failing. The Balkans is a great place. It's not far from Sweden. If you took just 1 year understanding the complexity and history of the Balkans, you would know why these faux, post-modern, neo-barbarian policies are doomed to catastrophic failure. But if you didn't do that, right, you just got the environmentalist type of conditioning, then you could commit catastrophic crimes against your own kind, or people even like you, by being a carrier of that type of contagion, which is essentially misinformation. Here's the cliff, turn left. Your sign says turn right. At a critical juncture. And if you're so Nobel oblige, you're part of the caste, classist system, then you have to know that all those misdirections do have a causality to them that you might be underestimating. So if you really are so rich, why don't you entertain the other point of view that committing such multiplying of misinformation is an extremely toxic thing to do and not worth it. Here's another great thing that rich people can afford. They can just afford to shut their mouths and disappear, and they will not starve. But if they're supposedly rich and then spouting off about things that are wrong, how is that rich? Like, what? Why would you develop pathogenic tendencies if you have every opportunity to develop the good things instead? Say the good things, to think the good thoughts, and to do the good deeds. And yet we see these warped personalities with their warped tastes and their toxic ideology and their toxic zealotry, and also their misdirection as far as morals, good sense, or anything else goes. So how many people will they take down with who knows? People being subjected to bad ideas as if it was cool, that is a form of trolling. It's just a very malicious, sadistic, and criminal kind. So don't put too much gold dust on those eyelids. Don't put on the red lipstick so much, or maybe do it a little bit more around the edges when you start to repeat such sweet lies. Do remember, or just have just a little prick of shame because you had the privilege to hear the truth. And change your ways. Just drop out, disappear. Yet, if you're a rich person and this is what you do, I would say the judgment should be a lot more severe. Just based on the fact that they had opportunities and they wasted them. They just allowed these infiltration programs to take place on the right, while also allowing the already infiltrated left be the incumbent party, more or less, the uniparty. And now we have a situation where the left is completely compromised and has been for decades now, that have been in government, have developed blobs, and the electorate is basically out of its mind at this point, and they're willing to go with the right that's already been compromised. Now people say, "Oh, you're compromised. What's this? What? Huh?" Well, yeah, hungry Orbanism, neoconism. Now it's a far-rightism. On the other hand, was Trump on that? See, because they like to project also where it's not true. Trump's obviously, he's a rightist, so he's right of the middle left. He's got to be a Russian. He's got to be, you know. So, yeah, they have not been doing their job. So we cannot have such a political fiasco without having such disastrous security services that should have had a better eye on these types of things. Orbanism is a complete and utter horrifying disaster. And it's wrecked Hungary, it's wrecked Austria, it's wrecked Slovakia, it's wrecking parts of Poland. It's wrecked the UK, it's wrecked the USA. Or is it attempting to wreck it? And then the news came out, this a trucker blockade that's happening in Poland, based out of Lublin, where they had all these so-called radical right parties that were completely suppressed, oppressed, run around in circles, infiltrated, game played, everything else, sabotaged, kneecapped, undercut. Well, some of them took garbage bag money and decided to turn their members into a human blockade to keep vital supplies from going to Ukrainians starving to death, potentially in the winter. So, this is hyperbole, starving to death. Well, what if there were medical supplies there? What do you know? Do you know that 2 truckers died during that incident? How many more have died? Stuck out there on the road, can't move because some apes, some traitors, are blocking the road for days on end and nobody's doing anything about it because we don't know who could possibly take care of this issue. These are legitimate right-wing elements, apparently. We can't do that. We can't arrest our own people that are getting paid to create international catastrophes. And they said they came up through the unions. Like that again is these types of political, semi-political organizers, community organizers somewhere along the line that segue with political do-nothings. They have connections to the workers, right? They tell them, oh, don't do this, but park your road across the highway because otherwise the whole country's in danger. Oh, and if you don't do it, then there's these 3 guys after work that are going to come and beat you to a pulp out of nowhere because we don't know why. We got all these guys hanging out in gyms thinking they're right wing while working for the Russians that have never been right wing. Never will be right wing, that more or less are run by people like Prigozhin, straight out of prison, that have nothing to do with Russia except that they get paid a lot of money to do a lot of bad things. So you're right wing and working with the Russians of today, you're not right wing at all. You're just part of a criminal enterprise that is deliberately messed up, that is deliberately compromised. And that is deliberately allowed to happen by the leftists, oddly enough. And so could that be part of the uni-party dynamic that we've been talking about? The only problem was they weren't so entrenched in Central Europe, so they just decided to go in militarily with the help of so-called nationalist right-wing parties. Isn't that a bit perverse on the face of it? Whereas the cored out Western Europe governments that are filled with the leftist variety, the same pestilence, somehow that's going to be a counterweight to that. You see how misled and abused and railroaded and gump-wumped the political system is, that's had security services that are either compromised or brain dead, or both. Because aren't they political appointees too at the end of the day? That's why criminal negligence, it's pretty clear at this point, because these things were evident, again, going back to the 60s and 70s, all these things were evident. There was no surprise in things like this. This is old hat. This is like Revenge of the Horse Buggy or something. The horse and buggy just jumped out of nowhere, surprised everyone. No, I don't think so. So you really do need to think also these security services, whether they should get the 15-year minimum or perhaps even something more severe. It's going to have to be up to a future tribunal, but the game they played was that they were too stupid to see it and too lazy to do anything about it. That's the MO that they're still playing to this day. And then, blindness, it's not happening, no. Gaslighting as well. So remember that when they're in front of the tribunal during and it's been identified that they had anything to do with any form of responsibility of that nature during this time of the 30 years of bandits. Although you could extend it. You can make it to 70-year bandits. I think that would apply as well. We might even have 80 years of bandits till things get turned around. So, but at this time, it's the 70 year of bandits. So, yeah, there needs to be churn, political churn. There needs to be blob churn. There needs to be a lot more churn and a lot less foolhardiness or naivete or gaslighting or alliances with criminal elements. I was thinking the other day, what are some of the defects that our current information systems have? Well, I would say that they're really missing an intellectual class, a class of free thinkers that aren't dangerous type people because they're just shooting the breeze as far as current events go, and then they can make their own opinions and then figure things out for themselves. But if these people are malicious and malignant and looking to mess up whatever they can mess up in the form of sabotage, be it social, economic, or political, or all three at the same time, because that's what goes on before military action and then during military action and probably after military action. So yeah, you need people that are higher grade analysts, synthesizers, developers, philosophers, scientists, social scientists, architects, just a plethora of civil society actors that obviously, in many cases, if they open their mouth, their intention is to, in some way, contribute to the betterment of their environments. And listen to that, environments. That's plural, that means internationally. Which is to say, if I've discovered that malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes as a scientist, which, when malaria was killing a lot of ancient Greeks in southern Italy, to the point that many of the settlements there were extincted, died out, had they known that information, they could have taken proactive actions to protect themselves. And imagine if I had saved 1,000 of them just by telling them the truth, how much good causality I would have set into motion into this otherwise forsaken world. So people that open their mouth, they're not hiding themselves. They're out in the open. Anybody can boo them. In fact, they're taking time out of their busy days to address issues that they believe should be addressed, or at least given a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth thought. Look at it from this perspective, this perspective. Oh, you were just looking at it from this? Look at it from this here. This might work better for you. So the more things that cultural geniuses expound on, the better for humanity. That every syllable that was recorded that conveyed Socrates to the world was a very useful and beneficial exercise to all of humanity, all of it. Which is to say, the arts and sciences transcend politics. They're over, above it. Now, that's not to say they're not beyond it. For example, the 30 years of banditry that I had the somewhat displeasure of experiencing were just unavoidable. It really does depend. If I look back and just look at the aggravating things, I could instantly lose my mind. And yet I can even there do a curation, and I absolutely should, because that is a personal development. I'm all for personal development. I think personal development, if people can get past greed, ill will, and delusion, that the world will be benefited by that. It reduces hostilities. It increases satisfaction. It increases also accomplishment. Because what archer can hit through the shaft into the bullseye consistently if he is of troubled mind, body, or soul? Or not so, as the case may be. So, taking reprieve from the humdrum world of materialism is an extraordinarily noble thing to do. It is not precociousness, it is not prickliness, it is not self-obsessedness. It's liberation. Something that some people know where to put that on the valuation chain of human achievement. And yet there are so many others. What is one of the main hindrances? It's ignorance, the simplest of things. You don't know what you're missing. If you don't have it or know such a thing can exist, can be possible, is achievable. If not permanently, then it's a permanent state of readiness to liberate oneself from the agitations of the world. And a fantastic, marvelous skill to achieve that goal time and again, just like the arrows, through the arrows to the center of the mark. The group of people that either attacks its poets or allows them to be attacked are the greatest of ignoramuses and the greatest of shame. And yet, when has a group ever protected any one of its members so well that we could not be attacked by something, even of the socio-economic, political kind, like we've been inundated with in our disastrous time? But what of time is disastrous? How much of it is falling into the abyss, and how much of it is being created by the geysers of lava shooting up into the sky, and the towers and columns of smoke that rage into the sky? What a tremendous shame has been cast upon the world in the form of the neutering and lobotomization of the social sciences, humanities, and every other thing having to do with culture, politics, and society at large. These damn pests that have politicized the political, they're a pestilence, they're a pox, a palsy, a ballsy, a dolsy, a lulsy. Because the jokes they tell aren't funny, and the results aren't funny either, so why should they be applauded when nothing they do has even an inkling of talent in it, other than the talent to make a mockery of oneself and others better than oneself, unfathomably better in every way than the vulgar monopoly that is today extant in this unfortunate year. And yet that's the other thing. Politics, these people, they have very sensitive ears. They don't like to hear criticism, especially when it's true. And they don't want to go away. They have a plan for themselves. And it does look very closely to be correlated with self-enrichment at the cost of brilliant futures. That they would prioritize their own interest over the interest of the majority. So yes, I am a Democrat in that sense. But Democrat doesn't mean everything, that people have to offer only the best. And yet there's more of them able to speak, to write poetry, to work on mathematical innovations, to live in peace, prosperity, and health. Every type of health, mental health, physical health, whatever has to do with health, they have it in abundance. So before we start screaming and screaming and screaming again at ourselves, what if we take the compassionate approach instead and say, well, we have a rather wickedly ill and misguided patient. How do we get back to more pacific climes, better conditions? I think that is a perfect starting point for practical people, but they needed to have the question posed to them first before they would get on it and make it a reality and start making revisions of these people who think they're eternally contemporary. And yet the only thing they've proven is that they're eternally vulgar and deranged. Now, before any dung beetles of this time feel enraged at such an accurate description of themselves, realize that with the concept of non-self, you don't need to feel addressed by any of those tongue lashings, because they weren't directed at you, because you do not exist. You are a delusion, if you want to look at it on an abstract level. You are the embodiment of it, you think that way, and you act with delusion, and the results are predictable. Why would someone who knows what you're afflicted with want you to continue to be delusional when that is the cause for enmity between you and a perceived other? That's the other delusion. Most times it's projection of the original delusion, which is the delusion of self. So you are a Russian and I am not, so I am your enemy, is that true? If you think one way, you can see things that way, and then you can act that way. What would an enemy do? Or what would you do to an enemy? Would you injure them? Well, what if the person isn't the enemy and you injure them? What then? So changing the way you think is really essential. And that way you think should be based on the facts. A generous person, someone who has devoted so much time to peace between friends, cannot be mistaken as an enemy. If you're doing it, you're delusional. Stop it. And stop doing you, if that's what it takes to stop being delusional. And many times, that's exactly what it takes. It absolutely is. Pull the plug on a railroaded identity. Start over. I keep coming back to the example, to bar fights. There you are sitting at the bar, Not that I recommend doing that, but there's lay people out there doing that. Hardworking people looking for just an ounce of reprieve from the immense amounts of daily suffering that they're subjected to. Just an ounce, even if it's poison. So there they are sitting, and then there's a misunderstanding between two parties. And one of them, because their ill will is also pretty high, which is also pretty understandable under pretty unskillful conditions that are in many cases self-made, and yet there is a causality to it that can grind you to dust and does grind people to dust. People are losing their minds right now. In this second, how many people do you think have lost their minds entirely to greed, ill will, or delusion? Come up with a number and make it high. You couldn't have prevented that, but they could have if they knew what skill was. And yet the barrier to the forum here is very wide because there's a lot of gatekeepers that don't belong there. Here's something for a filmmaker. Go back to the Colosseum and then the doors, and then just imagine the type of cronies that decide to make it their spots of influence. That then leads to a degrading of what is supposed to play out there. And you can have so many different scenes, so many different episodes, so many different chance meetings that convey the message that such type degenerations should not be tolerated by high civilizations. And yet, like a fungus, it can grow if it's not removed and properly disposed of. And yet, the more people you have, the more difficult that can be, because there's going to be maybe 20 people a year that tried that racket, much to the detriment of their times, if they succeed, much to the misdirection of it. Just imagine one of those dullards and drunkards that had one of the gates that was supposed to stay open. And that was the day that he decided to be drunk for days on end. And so when the caravan with the animals from the Silk Road arrived for the zoo, they were not adequately attended to, and no one knew that they were there. And because Persians were involved that could not communicate effectively, all of the animals died. How can that be repaid? Can he go back in time and rebirth those animals and transport them those great distances where there were many altercations with bandits, where there were horrible injuries and great losses, untold tales, because in foreign tongues and yet that drunkard and that dullard is symbolic of corruption and nepotism and not doing the right thing, but being manipulated into rationalizing the wrong thing. And that's essentially what they do, simplify. You can complicate things, you can simplify things. They do it, they get you to do it, stop doing it, and stop listening to them. Disconnect entirely from agitatory, manipulative, and also self-interested parties that are manifestly incapable of having any kinds of sympathies or understanding for something that is far outside the compass of their understanding. How about this? The guy that rolled in at some point because there was an alarm that was raised. The word sort of started to trickle out. There was like a panic in certain areas that somebody then knew, oh, this is Giuseppe. Let's go find him. And then imagine the state they found him in. And then slowly he starts coming to the fact that he needs to start making some explanations for once in his life. Why the hell he wasn't doing his job. And he comes up with a few things. I mean, he's sort of not all that put together. Not just in one way, but perhaps he's an illiterate buffoon, as well as having his high authority. And then it just escalates. It starts off real slow. And the people who ask him initially, they're looking at him with a bit of incredulity, because they just can't believe that life can produce such moronic bipeds. But it starts to swirl because this, people, they don't have a lot of things to talk about, but that's one of those things that there's a little bit of sensationalism involved in it. So a couple hours go by. What's happening today? The marketplaces. Somebody runs through screaming. Everybody starts looking around. Then everybody starts talking about it. And then a couple dutiful officers decide to inform the guy that was paying the other guy's checks the whole time, paying for his bread, in a fiduciary relationship that required some fidelity as well. Obviously not every day was one expecting perfect service, but such a flagrant disregard for mistakes like that cannot go unpunished because it hasn't gone unnoticed. It's as simple as that. That's at least how things work in a worldly world. So if Giuseppe, somebody could have told him a little, if he could have gotten back on track, even if he had screwed up for 2 years prior, or 4 years, but he somehow got himself back to the right way of doing things, the right way of seeing things, then all of that tragedy could have been avoided. All of that trauma. All of that death. That kind of death, you see, because it's not like saving the animals was going to save them from their ultimate fates. But it created a fate that was ignoble, given the circumstances. And that, my dear friends, should never be tolerated. But coming back to a second to the politicians of the, shall we say 30 years of bandits. Let's not go too far back. But we could. One thing I do like about them, though, is that public drama is just Tuesday to them. Every day's public drama for politicians. Some people are addicted to it. That's why they're there. They're gossips. They want to know. They want to be in a place when the guy goes screaming from the Coliseum with the new news. They want to be there first. They want to know. And most times, they don't care, which is a lot of times a good thing, because there's a lot of horrible things going on in the world that really are none of your business. So, but if you make it your business, if you get agitated by it, if you get addicted to agitation like that, you're not really doing yourself a favor. But some people are bored. Some people have been habituated into big cities, and if there's not a fire truck at least once a day, they start to develop some sense of ennui, which probably isn't healthy, but some people do live past 100 apparently, so some do know how to adapt to the conditions, sort of like an infantryman living in a trench in January. There are infantrymen that do it for years on end. And there are people who live in cities. And some of them make themselves reasonably comfortable given the quite extraordinary circumstances of potentially agitating news and things, such as blasts and things just going bump in the night. And if the city dweller dies at 55, even though he thought he was going to live till 103, well, the iron dice were rolled on him, weren't they? Who out there is rolling the iron dice? Who's going to live to the day they decided that they would? Because reasons. Every day we roll the iron dice. Or every day the iron dice are rolled on us. Every minute of every day. But coming back to wokery for a second, because these really are high-level criminals that kick that off and keep it moving and organized, is that essentially it's an agitation program that is then misdirected to false targets for politically self-interested parties that are substitutionist in nature. This leads inevitably to declining conditions across the board, including innovation, because they're essentially decapitating innovative and authentic people of accomplishment and correct loyalties, and not the slavery to an extraction program, which is what the international represents. It's just an extraction program. It's not a distribution and flourishing program, unfortunately, for the people that get bamboozled by these operators. So, no root and branch it needs to go. It's part of a foreign occupation. It's just ideological. So they have people who purvey it, they have people that build the poison frames, and there's people that maintain and finance the poison frames, and all of them are working together in unison for bad causality of the majority of the populations that they infect. And you can have one infection like the 60s, and then some of it dies out, not all of it takes root, but it takes root in certain places, and then you can have doubling and tripling down, especially if core despotic countries are funding billions into the project under the aegis of some quite questionable financial legitimacies. Because one thing I do know about sound politics is you don't treat enemies like friends. But see, they're friends, if they're political, then they create the friendly policy towards more or less an unfriendly or unfriendly multipolar actors. Become a broker for them. So people engaged in that behavior, nothing about them is worth anything. It's just they don't want you to know that, because then if you know that, how would you react? Well, they don't see a profit in that, do they? So it's about constant misdirection. And that's why they're so heavily invested in these misinformation bubbles that they keep 24/7, 365. Imagine that 50%, I just said, in this time, unwatchable. And of the other 50%, 80%, or okay, let's say 50% if I'm going to be generous, pretty odd and distorted. So who's financing that? Who's managing that? Who's directing that? They're implicated. And anyone who's in a sociological or humanities department that's working on that, they're all in on it too. You can't produce trash if you're not a trash producer. And trash producers are trained in a very special way. It's very manipulative and very misleading. Very off-putting, like on a visceral level. Just, again, rainforest people are your baseline. They're sort of your control. You tell them stories and then they look at outcomes like, completely tattooed and pierced people that otherwise would be wearing jaunty suits and dresses, but not of the stuffy kind, perhaps performance kind. But because they've been mentally, their brains, their psychology's been scrambled like an egg, they're not really the valuable people they could have been under more fortunate conditions. So of course these crimes have victims, and the victims are all around us. We're victims because they affect us too. It's a social contagion. It's a social pathogen. And again, getting back to Russian history, 1917, then you had, well, even before that, a Mongolian Khanate. You have different groups there, 11 time zones. You could have some very poisonous and hateful and misaligned factions that could have decided on something like this for their long-term benefit. That's the other problem with countries. We like to think, oh, this is all being done by our Fangarian friends. Nope, probably not. You don't know. What they're presenting is something they want to present. They want you to think that way. But what do their actions say instead? Blowing up civilian infrastructure? Who does that? Well, if you're thinking of a nice little Russian person, maybe you're not seeing who's really behind it. So just imagine it's one of those things. It's some militant Turkic tribe, Mongolian tribe, that has a certain leverage over the military, maybe. Is that inconceivable? And then you say, okay, wow, have these people ever been good for Europe or Europeans or Western civilization, ever? Was there ever a time? Or was there just a time when they made people believe that was the case, especially gullible, greedy, and morally misguided people? But people with mesmeric techniques and emotionalisms and sort of a routine of manipulation and misdirection and railroadings, accusations, and excludings, and poison framings and things like that. Now, that could just be anyone, really. It could be anything, it could be any group that wants to be that way for whatever worldly reasons that they give themselves. That's a self-rationalization loop as well. People that specialize in self-rationalizations to do the prisoner dilemma to gain advantage. Well, if that if that is allowed to spread, the results are disastrous. That's the result. All of North Africa, that's pretty much what happened there. It was a wonderful Roman, Egyptian, Greek project for many, 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 many good centuries. Go visit those places now, let the cameras roll, and make some scientific explanations, like for just basic stuff, like does the sanitation work, yes or no? And then if not, why not? Like a 1-2 liners. And then on the basis of that analysis, come up with like a number. This is an enlightened society. This is a barbaric society type thing. It would be quite nice if you are a scientist and not a damn liar, like these social scientists are, or have been. Then that could be very valuable insights, really. But you just realize that's insightful for war operators as well, cultural war operators that actually want that to happen to people they don't like, and they don't like the West, or its freedoms, or its prosperity, or its power, or its vision, or its ability to communicate with itself effectively, or to make effective decisions or policies or whatnot, because they're always trying to screw those up. And so these types of operators, they're all over the place now. You got termites, that's something you could see it as. You got termites, and those termites, they're pretty much more insidious than you think. And you can say, hey, termites, why don't you leave? They're not going anywhere unless fundamentally the environmental's changed drastically, not in their favor. And I do recommend moving. If your house is infested with termites, maybe the planning wasn't all that good, including site, choosing the site in the first place, and certainly maintenance, and maybe it was bigger than you needed. If you only needed a shack, why did you build a bigger building that was more prone to some type of infection that you wouldn't have noticed because it was on some weird angle that you didn't catch until it was too late type thing? But be that as it may, this is one of the advantages of living in the material world, is that you can burn it down and build back another one and take all that experience into account, and we can look at civilizations that way. Not that I'm recommending any foolhardy people do that, because that's also can be misapplied. You get a bunch of zealots doing stupid stuff, that's sort of their misdirection program. You can also just leave places that are no longer functioning as they once did. This is another thing. Human beings, why does ignorance, why is it so deadly? Well, I'm living in the same city. Obviously, it's the same city. Nothing's changed. Well, actually, the fundamentals of your organizational, socio-economic, political structure have fundamentally changed for the worse. So what is the name of a city that isn't what it once was or is functioning as it was built to be? You had people, you had a system, they don't see a problem in being substituted with something inferior. So where either that tendency changes, or you need to assess the situation and make the right, possibly dramatic decisions for yourself. Catherine the Great, when was it? The 19th century, mid-19th century. she offered favorable conditions to German settlers to come into Russia and to develop the place. Well, look how politics changed, and then they were persecuted. Then 91 came around, they could leave, finally, and some of them did. Some of them, how about this, some of them left. See, after the Crimean War, the Russians were pissed off, and so they tried to blame the Germans as being a part of their loss type thing. That type of chauvinism was already pretty common amongst their ranks. So after they lost the Crimean War, pretty much the entire situation had changed. The whole relationship sort of chilled, and just think of the crazies that were at the top, that were formulating at that time. The best thing about Alexander II is they called him the peasant czar, so he was somewhat of a peasant, but just think what that means as well. How enlightened are peasants, do you think? Well, that's about as enlightened as he was, too. So, yeah, all of those things have bad causality. You have bad leaders, dumb leaders, almost strong leaders. So this is a stable leadership type leaders. Potato king leaders, that's precarious at best. You can more or less be thankful if there's stability, but that's not a given, because the leadership is anything but enlightened. Just might be good enough. That's about it. But yeah, some of the Germans then, they knew the writing was on the wall, and they bounced to someplace else. It was a good time under good conditions. The conditions change. As much as you don't want to admit it, as much as you don't want to admit it, as much as you could have imagined something so differently, you're just attached to an idealization that is delusional. But it feels right to hold on to it, and yet it keeps you from taking right action. Those that left, that was the right thing to do. Those that stayed, this is the rump people, isn't it? The people that stay no matter what. These are the barnacles. God love them. I mean, if there wasn't barnacles somewhere, where would we all be? Cities are sort of like barnacles. But some barnacles, they do grow in the wrong place, and it might take 10 years. They're going to get a whack if they stay. So it's really hard to get geopolitics right, because things are changing constantly and not for the best. And personalities matter, which means delusion matters, which means potentially bad causality matters. That's the other thing, wanting to live the perfect life and missing all of these artillery strikes. Well, you can get lucky, but you can get unlucky too. And sometimes, how about this, these socioeconomic political artillery strikes, they can hit you and you can still not die, and you can still just let your delusion about those things die and carry on as a ghost. But not as a hungry ghost, as a neutral ghost, as a ghost of equanimity. We're talking people that have been subjected to massive artillery barrages. It's more of a physiological situation, because their brain has been physiologically altered. And the nerves need to heal themselves. It's an injury. And that takes a lot of time, and it might not be perfect but you might not see any like real physical injuries, but it's internal organs, like your liver got punched real hard. You can't see that on someone if there's no longer any black and bluing on the outside, but inside you don't know what their liver is looking like. So it's sort of like that. Now that is like a really serious case. Then there's the psychological component, which can either aggravate the first component as the second component, or it could just be the second component. How about this? There was you had a chance meeting with someone, and you said goodbye. They rolled away, and they never came back. And what that essentially is, it's an attachment to something. And what causes the suffering or the pain is the discrepancy between wanting something and not having it. And that you can abstract to anything. And that's just basic unskillfulness. It's a basic misperception of the world. It's a normal perception. It's a perception normal people have until their perceptions are shaken, and that's sort of the state that they're left in. Or they only assume that normalcy would be this way, but they live this way, and they can't really get back to seeing things in a normal way. But what is a normal way? Well, maybe you don't need to accept the normal way. Maybe you can also give yourself the solitude that is required to develop no self, or new self, or letting images go again and again and again. They come back, you let them go. You understand how the process works, and you understand that you have the autonomy as far as mental imagery goes. It will come to you unwanted, but you can drop it with skill. Comes back, you drop it with skill. And unfortunately, the more dramatic the event was, the harder it is to sort of forget or erase from your mind, because it's made that really intense, indelible impression on your mind. That's why it's hard to keep up with the pace of dropping it, because it's really close. It's like been burnt. And you think of it like an electrical cord, it is a large diameter cable that transmits even the smallest type of electrical charge. Whereas if you can thin that down and sort of break up, add more installation, because you really don't want those signals being transferred to your mind. If you can reduce the diameter down to finally a thread, then even if there's signals coming from somewhere, it doesn't really register on your monitor or into your consciousness, into your present world. And that's the other thing, keep it in the present. Don't go to the past, don't go to the future. Both of those are minefields. Oh, wasn't the past so great, so sentimental, or so delusional, and isn't this so bad or so different than what I imagined, or it's just going to get worse, then you switch over into the future. So you're carrying things from the past and making comparisons, or you're awfulizing what possibly could occur in the future, or you're just projecting an existence that isn't acceptable based on whatever baseline you had in terms of expectations, and that's the difference. That's the aversionary difference. Now, if you start flowing over into the world is unjust, then you can just say that it had to be this way, that there was a causality to it, and this causality might have started in a previous life. Could have been something like that. That's also, it gives you an option to get into metaphysics, because we got these damn materialists out here, a lot of misguided psychologists and sociologists and the humanities in general, they don't want to admit that spiritual metaphysics can be a great relief to human beings. They don't want to admit that. They always want to throw shade on that because they have no faith, they're not believers, they've been stunted in their viewpoints. But metaphysics is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful garden. It's light as a feather, lighter than a feather. You don't have to deal with material things. You can gain reprieve from it. You can live as a solitary, and that's perfectly okay. You don't need to have a social orientation. You can also give yourself permission to retire. This was enough. You're retired from the world. You're now in a metaphysical world that isn't bothered by worldly things, except the most basic things. And then you find a way to appreciate that. Like eating, you take eating more seriously. Like, what are you eating? When? Don't eat after noon. Make that just random rule for yourself. Not so random rule. So from sunrise to noon you can eat, but not afternoon, just because. And then you can expect there to be cravings, and then you can overcome those cravings because you've got that basic discipline, but that basic discipline carries over into how you think and what bothers you, and consequently what no longer bothers you. And give yourself enough time for the journey, enough time for the practice. You will not become an excellent archer on the first day, second, or even possibly a year or 2 or 3. Give yourself the time that it takes to develop these types of skills. They're the highest skills that there are. And realize the people that are rich, that don't have these skills, they're not skillful. People that are poor, that do have these skills, they're skillful. So it is completely separate from the worldly realm. It's a different area of activities, and it does matter. Every book you've ever read came from the place of metaphysics, the realm of ideas, of images. And yet we have this vulgar conception that's not work, that's nothing, that's entertainment, that's diversionary. Now, good books are a simulation of perhaps skillful thinking, but there's a lot of unskillful books as well. Many of the cultural distortions in modern times, more or less, came from the distribution of bad ideas that warped people's minds and expectations. And in many ways, that's what the degeneracy of Romanticism was all about. A lot of disappointed, misguided people. Ideas are dangerous. They're grenades. Your mind slips back to a bad time. You've just allowed yourself to be robbed of a moment that could have been neutral, at least, which is preferable to bad things. So don't hold on to thoughts. They're not you. They're not yours. Even if it happened to you, it's the way you're seeing it that's making it painful. Otherwise, you could just see it with complete neutrality. There you are, like a slow motion flying through the air, right through the window at the top. And the fire blast is like below you, and you're flying through trees. You're doing somersaults, and then you just get straight out of the atmosphere and into the stars.